Hi, my name is Nobukhosi Zulu-Taruza, and I am the Law and Policy Specialist at Ilifa Labantwana. I am delighted to be here today, and I'm joined by my good friend Tatiana Kazim. Tatiana is a research associate at the Center for Law and Society at GCT, as well as the legal advisor at SmartStart. And Tatiana is also the former chair of the Real Reform Legal Subcommittee and a previous member of the steering committee. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tatiana. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, great. Thank you. Earlier this month, the Real Reform hosted the Right to Development in ECD Symposium, where Tatiana, together with Narina Ali, presented an exciting new framework that explores the right to development in the context of early childhood development. The symposium was a wild success, and we had a lot of incredible legal brains that joined the Real Reform team to discuss all the legal implications around developing a right to ECD. We at Ilifa, as a part of the Real Reform Collective, are thrilled to hear more about this important framework that Tatiana and Irina have developed. So, Tatiana, just to start us off, please can you walk us through briefly through the framework that you and Irina developed? What are its core focus, and how does this intersect with the ECD sector in South Africa?
Absolutely. So I'm going to start by giving some context for the framework, so that you can understand why we thought it was necessary to develop something like this. And I guess a key piece of background is that it is increasingly well accepted that early childhood is an extremely important time in a person's life. As you well know, Nobu, in this phase, children develop more rapidly than at any other time. They are more susceptible to external influences, and the foundation is really laid for their future life outcomes, for their future well-being and success. And there's quite a lot of empirical research at this stage that has sort of been adopted and accepted at an international level that suggests that in order to survive, develop, and thrive, young children in this phase need a whole range of different interconnected services. So they need early learning opportunities, but also responsive caregiving, adequate nutrition, good health, safety and security, opportunities to play, and opportunities to participate in cultural life. And these are all necessary components of holistic early childhood development. Now, a lot of listeners, I think, will know that South Africa's constitution recognizes a whole range of different rights on the part of children specifically, but it doesn't explicitly recognize a right to early childhood development holistically understood. Now, the question Narina and I asked ourselves was, does this mean that there is no such right in South Africa? Is it the case that there is no right to early childhood development? And our answer was no. We think that there is a right to ECD implicit in the Constitution, and our framework helps to show how it can be identified with the help of international law. And so we think of the right to ECD as being like an umbrella. So you have the overarching right, that's kind of the canopy of the umbrella, and that's the holistic right to early childhood development. And then that canopy is held up by lots of individual spokes. And the spokes are specific rights to early learning, to nutrition, to responsive caregiving, to play, and so on. And each of those component rights also has a set of corresponding duties on the part of different government departments and other role players. So you can think of it in that way, as this overarching right to holistic development held up by these different spokes, which are the specific rights and the duties that relate to those rights.
Thanks. That's so incredible and interesting. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned the full nurturing care framework because that's the work that Ilifa with our partners have been doing for many years and trying to ensure that we reach a point where there's universal access for children in ECD. And in South Africa recently, we've seen some very positive changes in that acknowledgement of ECD as a priority, the increase in budget. Um, Tatiana, in this, given the current policy environment in South Africa and the push for universal access across the different spectrum. How do you think this framework can help us reimagine what meaningful access looks like for all children, in a
Mm.
real way, um, and particularly for children that are marginalized and don't currently have access?
Mm. I think, as you were saying just now, this really is a critical moment for the ECD sector in South Africa. And I think it's worth sort of rewinding to where we were a few years ago so that we can really understand how far we've come and why this moment is so important. Um, for a long time, for too long, ECD was neglected, and the burden of providing nurturing care for South Africa's youngest citizens was falling almost entirely on the shoulders of Black women who had very little government support for the vital work that they do. And as we know, the ECD programs run by these women were underfunded and they were overregulated. And that, to a large extent, is still the case, and it has dire consequences for young children, most of whom are not on track to thrive by 5 years old. Thankfully, though, things are starting to change, and the political will behind ECD is stronger than ever. The Department of Basic Education took over responsibility for ECD in April 2022, and they've gotten on board with this project of ensuring universal access to early learning programs, and as well, importantly, to coordinating the different government departments that are involved in securing that holistic package of ECD services for all children, and to passing the laws and policies to provide an enabling regulatory framework for these measures. What does it mean when we say universal access? I think you made a really important point that it's about ensuring access for children and communities who until now have been marginalized. So rural communities, township communities where there aren't sufficient ECD programs always, and where the programs are particularly struggling to provide quality services for young children, and where in fact programs are most locked out of entering the regulatory framework and accessing the state subsidy. It's this catch-22 where it's often the programs that most need the support that are least able to access it because of the way that the laws are currently set up. So that's something that really needs to change. It's something that the Department of Basic Education knows needs to change and is busy working on. How does this right to ECD, how does this fit in? How does our framework support, I guess, the work that's currently going on? Well, even though there is this kind of political will, especially within the DBE, a right to ECD just hasn't been well recognized yet by civil society, by the courts, or by other spheres of government and by other government departments. And so that means that the political will behind ECD isn't matched by a clear and widespread understanding of its constitutional foundations. And this is evident in the laws, regulations, policies, and governance structures for ECD, not just the ones that sort of sit within the DBE's mandate, but also laws and policies that sit with other government departments as well. It's a widespread problem, and the lack of understanding of the right to ECD is sort of really underpinning, I guess, what we see in the regulatory framework across the board. Recognizing a constitutional right to ECD could really help turn this around. It would have a lot of advantages. It would elevate this interest to the highest point in the legal system, and that would put it on an equal footing with other constitutional rights and make it more difficult to erode. It would make it more difficult for different role players to fail to recognize their role or to live up to their role. It could also be an effective tool for advocacy and mobilization. Rights command the respect of others in society, and they can be invoked so that claims are taken seriously. But finally, rights also play a role in articulating obligations. So a right to ECD would set a standard against which the existing laws and policies can be assessed, and could guide the development of new laws and policies, which could really help to bring this commitment to universal access to life in a real way.
That's so good, Tatiana. Thank you. I personally really enjoyed reading the framework, and I know it's still a work in progress. And but something that I thought was really powerful about the framework was the way in which when you look at it, you're able to see the holistic needs of a child. And I know it's generally often discussed, but the way in which you and Narina have packaged the needs of a child, asking the questions, what inputs does a child need, and who's responsible for making sure that children are able to get what they need, and not just looking at children as an end product, like just did they pass matric, but rather who are they here now today? What do they need? Even, exciting things like the right to play and asking those questions, how can we ensure that the legal system allows children to be able to grow and play in a holistic manner that they need? So I'm very excited about seeing where this framework goes and the incredible changes that I believe it can make in the ECD sector. And unfortunately, our time has run out. But thank you so much for that incredible explanation. Just one last question, Tatiana. What do you see as the next steps for the framework, and how do you envision it shaping advocacy and policy, like you've already said, but what are the next practical steps that you are going to take with this framework in partnership with all the people that you work with?
So Narina and I will develop the framework into an academic paper so that we can share it more widely with other experts and test the ideas that are in the framework. But more importantly, the Real Reform for ECD movement is going to take this framework and use it as a launchpad for developing a national campaign so that everyone, local governments, provinces, businesses, families, ECD practitioners, all understand that ECD is a fundamental right, that it's a holistic right with all these different components, not just early learning, and so that they act accordingly. So that's exciting, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what Real Reform does with this. The last important piece, I think, in terms of next steps is how the framework could inform thinking around a new ECD Act. So we're really hoping that this framework will get into the hands of people who are thinking about longer term law reform, and they can use it as a basis for fundamentally reimagining the law on ECD. So DBE, as I mentioned, is currently busy with these urgent reforms to the laws that are needed in order to make it easier for ECD programs to register and access government funding. But I think there's a recognition that a deeper reimagining also needs to happen so that we're fundamentally thinking of ECD in a different way and regulating it in a different way. So that in a similar way to the Schools Act, we have a whole act regulating schools. We would have a whole act devoted to ECD. And we're hoping that the framework could really help to inform that new act.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tatiana, for joining us today and for sharing these insights and the depth of thinking behind the framework. It is encouraging to see such a clear articulation of the right to development within the ECD space. And I think for me, especially one that connects legal theory, advocacy, and the practical implementation of what this needs to look like for it to become a reality. If you want to gain access to the framework, click on the link below and download it. And whilst you're at it, go ahead and follow us to keep updated with the work that we're doing.